Last night, Bobby and Bill did a great job of talking to us about the 5 threats to oneness in marriage. Do they sound familiar? Can you remember all 5? The first one was the problem of difficult adjustments, remember? It used to be, 100 years ago, when you got married, you married the boy or the girl from the farm down the road. Today, you can choose your mate from the 4 corners of the globe. That means, odds are, people married today with someone more different from them than ever before. And the more differences you have, the more difficult adjustments you have to make. Then, Bobby talked to us about the problem of that 50-50 performance relationship, that we enter marriage with a kind of business arrangement, expecting to do our part only when they do their part. But as Bobby said last night, the guy who says he'll meet you halfway is usually a bad judge of distances. And then Bill came up and talked to us about the problem of self-centeredness, which, if you think about it, is the worst of all the 5 threats, isn't it? Because the other 4 are really just the result of how you were raised or educated growing up. But the problem of selfishness, who taught you to be selfish? No, you came by that naturally, and so did I. It's just a part of human nature, and it's the worst of all the threats. Whatever's going to deal with that problem has to be able to get inside us and actually change our attitudes and motives. Isn't that right? The 4th threat was the failure to anticipate the certainty of difficulties that will come your way. Either the failure to just count on them coming, or the failure to work through them together as a team when they come your way. And then last of all, Bill said, the 5th threat was extramarital affairs. Not just that traditional love affair, but affairs in all their different forms. Things we turn to instead of our mate as a source of fulfillment in life. The 5 threats to oneness. Now, we left you last night pretty depressed, didn't we? Well, that's okay. We just want you to know we understand the problem. We know where people are coming from, and it's this morning that we want to begin to talk about how to work our way back from the 5 threats. So we're on page 46. The session's entitled God's Purposes for Oneness. You know, I went to college to study art, or pre-unemployment. That's what we called it. If you are going to be an art major, you are required to take a number of courses in the history of art. I loved art history because in art history class, you don't meet in an ordinary classroom. You meet in the theater, and you sit in a nice, soft, overstuffed chair that reclines a little bit. They turn off all the lights, and for 45 minutes, they show slides. Slides of paintings and sculpture and architecture, and 45 minutes later, you wake up and go home. Now, that's my idea of what education is supposed to be like. Somehow, through the process of sleep learning, I actually retain some knowledge of the history of art. For example, if you've ever seen a photograph of the Acropolis in Greece, the most famous temple on the Acropolis is the Parthenon. The Parthenon was built before the time of Christ. Did you know that the Parthenon was in almost perfect condition until the 1700s? It lasted in perfect condition for 2 millennia. But now you may have noticed there's no roof. What happened to the roof on the Parthenon? Well, in the 1700s, the Greeks were at war with the Turks. The Turks had seized the Acropolis and the Parthenon, and they were using the Parthenon as an armory, as a storehouse for gunpowder. And one day, somebody dropped a match, and that's what happened to the roof on the Parthenon. Now, everybody here can picture Leonardo da Vinci's famous painting of the Last Supper, right? It's not really what we call a painting, it's what's called a fresco. That means it's painted on the plaster of a wall. It can't ever be moved. If you've seen a photograph of the Last Supper, you may have noticed that the lower third of the painting is very badly worn. In fact, in some places it almost disappears. What happened to it? Well, that room where the Last Supper is painted was used for several years by the military as a stable. It's where they kept their horses. And every day, the horses would walk back and forth and rub up against the painting and wore off the lower third. Now, everybody here can picture the Great Sphinx, right? Near the Great Pyramids at Giza in Egypt. It has the head of a man, but the body of a lion. It was built before the time of Christ as well. But if you've seen a recent photograph, you've seen what bad shape it's in. For example, the nose is gone. What happened to the nose? Well, it was in the 1700s. Just a bad century for art all the way around. Napoleon had invaded Egypt, and Napoleon's troops one day decided to use the Sphinx as a target for cannon practice, and they were pretty good. And that's what happened to the nose on the Sphinx. Now, I can see you're all falling asleep here because you're not into art history. But if you have any appreciation for art, or at least if you can appreciate the genius and the effort that it took to create these masterpieces, doesn't it make you wish that you could kind of do a quantum leap back into history? Doesn't it make you wish you could step into these situations and say, wait a minute, hold it. Do you know what this is? Do you know what you've got here? See, that's the attitude this morning that we're trying to bring to marriage. See, the problem with marriage is that at a certain age, everybody's married. It's just the most common and ordinary thing, and you lose your sense of what this thing is, what you've got here. So what we want to do this morning is, well, we want to be philosophers. We want to try to get out of our 21st century shoes and try to take a fresh look at what marriage was intended to be. So on page 46 in your notes, letter A says, consider the question, why marriage? Now, no single person ever asked that question. But after several years of marriage, that's when you begin to ask. You know, Socrates once said, stay single. But if you must marry, it will make you a philosopher. I figure we've probably got about 550 philosophers in here this morning, and that's good, because you need to be a philosopher to try to take a fresh look at marriage. Now, letter B, a very fair question. B says, why should we use the Bible as our guide to experiencing oneness? And the honest answer to the question is, you don't have to. If you want to learn more about marriage, just go down to your local Borders or B. Daltons, whatever you have here. Ask for the section of books on marriage and the family. It's at least a row, probably a whole section of books. Just look through, find one you like, take it home and read it. If you don't find any you like, don't despair. Just come back in a year, and all those books will be gone, and all new books will have taken their place. Books that give the latest trend, the latest fad, and the latest research on the institution of marriage. But you know, that's the problem, isn't it? Because marriage isn't the latest thing. Marriage is the oldest thing. From the time there was a man and there was a woman, there was the institution of marriage. So maybe what we're really looking for here is not the latest trend or fad. Maybe we're looking for something that is ancient, time-tested, that's proven itself over centuries. That's what the Bible does. And by the way, it does one more thing. It adds a dimension to the discussion that you'll find in almost none of those books. You see, the Bible's view is that we are essentially spiritual beings, that spirituality is just a part of life. And if you ignore the spiritual dimension of life, you can't talk about marriage. In fact, you can't talk about much of anything in a thorough way. And the Bible does address the spiritual nature and the spiritual dimension of marriage. And that's why this morning we're using it as our guide to experiencing oneness. So if we do that, if we use the Bible as our guidebook to oneness, what will we find there? Well, look at letter C. You'll find this idea, that marriage is God's idea. Sounds awfully basic, doesn't it? But that's the most radical thing that we'll say all day today. You may miss it. Why is this so radical? Because if you go to any local university and ask someone there, what is marriage? 9 times out of 10, you'll be told marriage is a cultural invention. Marriage is something every culture invents for itself, defines it what they want it to be, and it's in a constant state of reinvention. This is a place where the Bible disagrees. The Bible claims that marriage has its origin in the mind of God, that marriage is rooted in human biology. Now, what does that mean? Why is that important? Well, it means if marriage actually has a nature, then we have 2 choices. You can either reinvent the wheel, you can either try to remake marriage to be what you want it to be, or you can take a look at the original blueprint. So if we did that, if we looked at the original blueprint, what would we find? Well, things like this. Number 1, God designed marriage to be, now the rest of this you could just put quotation marks around. I think it's a great simple definition of a marriage. God designed marriage to be a lifetime commitment between one man and one woman. That's what marriage was intended to be. 2 says God designed marriage as the first social institution of life. As I said before, from the time there was a man and there was a woman, the resulting relationship was not a limited partnership. It wasn't the Elks Club. It was a marriage, the first social institution in life. And 3 says God designed marriage to be the first system of interdependent relationships. Not independent, not dependent, but a situation where two equals come together and depend upon one another for things that they don't have as individuals. Interdependent relationships. And then 4, God designed the marriage relationship as the priority relationship of the family. If you have kids, do your kids ever ask questions that you don't know how to answer? Do they do that? You know, Dave Barry once said, the whole art of parenting is just being able to make up answers without hesitating. When my daughter Kelsey was very small, she was standing in the bathroom one day watching me shave. And she said, "How come you have fur on your chest but not on your back?" She said, "How come you have to shave your chin but not your forehead?" She said, "How come you have hair in your ears but not on your ears?" I said, "Where's your mother?" Which dads know is the answer to all questions, right? Well, my kids have always been this way. One evening when we were telling the girls goodnight, and they always shared a bedroom, you know, you got to kind of rotate to cover all the bases there. So I gave my daughter Erin a hug and a kiss and was moving over to Kelsey's bed. And as I got up, Erin looked up at me and she said, "Do you love me more than anything in the world?" You know, I had no idea what to say to that. So I said, "No. I met your mom before I met you, so I guess I love her more than I love you." You know, I got up and I looked over at my wife with that look that says, "Have I destroyed my child?" But you know, what I've learned in the years since is that that's not only the right answer, it's really the answer that she wanted to hear. Because for a child, a lot of their sense of security, a lot of their sense of being loved comes not from the love you show directly to them, but from the love that you show to their mother or their father. They want to know, is everything going well on the home front? Because if you love each other, then I feel loved. Your kids want your marriage to work. Your kids, no matter what they said, are glad you're here this weekend. Because if your marriage gets better, they will benefit from it. They sense the reality that marriage is the priority relationship of the family. And what we're telling you here is that your marriage was designed to outlast your children. Do you understand? Your marriage was designed to outlast your children. At the bottom of the page, D says, God's design for oneness in marriage is at the heart of God's purpose for mankind. Now, the word you're writing in right now is oneness. It's kind of the theme word for our whole weekend. We'll talk about it over and over again. So as you turn your page, let's give it a kind of definition. See, one says, oneness can be defined as being in joyful agreement with God's will and purposes. Now, if you are thinking with me this morning, that should strike you as an odd definition. That's not what I would expect. I would expect it to say oneness can be defined as being in joyful agreement with each other. Isn't that oneness? Why should it be agreement with God's will and purposes? Well, because of number 2. You see, 2 says oneness is to be experienced on 2 levels. First, vertically in our relationship with God, and then horizontally in our relationships with husbands and wives, children, friends, and everybody else around us. See, the Bible seems to teach that life is relationships, but all the relationships in life could be divided into 2 categories, the category of the vertical and the horizontal. A relationship with the one who created us and a relationship with all those around us. And the Bible is telling us that these 2 dimensions of relationships were meant to work together as a unit, as an organic whole. They were never meant to be separate. In fact, the Bible goes so far as to say success here, in your marriage, in your friendships, in raising your children, success in the horizontal dimension is found in that vertical dimension. Why is that so? You know, I do a lot of writing here. You'll see some of our books outside, the books that we write on marriage. I also write books on murder. I write novels. It's a little awkward to be writing books on both marriage and murder. It sounds like I'm hedging my bets, you know? But my wife and I have no conflicts at all. It's really good. No, I write books on forensic science. I write novels on murder. I'm writing a book right now on bioterrorism, on a bioterrorist attack on New York City. So I'm reading a lot of stuff on terrorism right now. Here's an interesting story that I came up with. From several years ago in Stockholm, in Sweden, a group of terrorists seized a train. Now, why do you seize a train? I mean, with an airplane, at least you can say, turn this thing around and fly it to Havana. What do you do with a train? You're sort of stuck. But then nobody ever said that terrorists were the brightest crayons in the box either, right? Typical terrorist scene, they get a bunch of hostages on the train, and they have political demands they want. Either you release my political prisoners, or we will begin to assassinate these hostages. Well, it's a common scenario today, and so there are psychologists who are trained in terrorist hostage negotiation, and that's what the story was all about. What happened is they set up sandbags across from the train, these professional trained psychologists, and the negotiations began. They waited for the very first request from the terrorists. The terrorists said, "We want food." And the negotiators said, "Great, fine, what do you want?" And they sent food on board the train. Then the negotiators waited for the second request, and it had to be something very simple and harmless. In this case, it was blankets. "We want blankets." And the negotiators said, "No, no blankets." Now, why would he do this? Can you imagine the atmosphere on the train? Can you imagine how their attitudes changed? Can you imagine how angry the terrorists became? But not only that, can you imagine how angry the hostages became when they learned that this idiot, this supposed professional who was holding their lives in his hands, didn't think that their lives were worth a blanket? So what's happening on the train? What's happening is these two parties, terrorist and hostage, who a moment ago were squared off, face to face, enemies, had now turned shoulder to shoulder. They had become friends because now they were facing a third party together, weren't they? They had a common goal now. And they call this the Stockholm Syndrome. It's a phenomena that everybody understands now. Well, you know, I think the Stockholm Syndrome works for us as well. As the guys were telling you last night, in marriage, in life, in human nature, there's just this natural drift towards isolation. You want your marriage to go bad? What do you need to do? Not a thing. Just stand still. And like two boats, as Bobby said, you will just slowly begin to drift apart. That means in every marriage, there is a natural tendency to do this, right? To stand face to face and to square off around what you want and what you think you deserve. 50-50 bargaining relationship. But what if there was some third party? What if there's someone that would make us do this? Just turn shoulder to shoulder and have a common focus, a common goal. Then you know what? For the first time in marriage, we would actually become what we were intended to be, partners in life. And that's what God always intended to be. The third party that we turn to so that we become the partners we should be. All right, what have we said so far this morning? All I'm doing is laying a kind of philosophical groundwork. All I'm saying is, look, marriage is no accident. Marriage had its origin in the mind of God. He designed it. And what do we find when we look at the original design? Well, it's the first social institution of life. It's important to the very purposes God has for humankind. And it's all based on this idea of oneness, but oneness comes in two dimensions. And the secret to oneness on the horizontal dimension is found in the vertical dimension. So what we want to do here, beginning in the middle of your page, is kind of flip back through that original blueprint and take a look at the original plan for marriage. What is it that marriage was supposed to do? All right, here's the very first page of your blueprint. The first original purpose for marriage. Purpose number one, originally marriage was intended to mirror God's image. In the book of Genesis, which is the very first of the 66 separate books that make up our Bible, it says this, "And God created humanity in his own image. Male and female, he created them. And so letter A says God made humanity to mirror his image on planet Earth. You know, contrary to popular opinion, we are not gods. I like that t-shirt that says, there are two things you need to know. Number one, there is a God. Number two, you are not he. Good reminder. But the Bible says we are more like God than any other living thing on the planet, in that we have a sense of morality, we have a sense of eternity, right? We're more like God than anything else. But gender plays a role in this. That means there is something about maleness that's very much like the nature of God. And there's something about femaleness that's very much like the nature of God. And these differences are not accidental differences. That's why B says God made two distinctly different humans, male and female, so that together they would reflect the image of God. The nature of God's so complex and so diverse, it takes two very different human beings with all their uniqueness coming together in a harmonious relationship to begin to reflect what God himself is really like. You know, for the last 40 years, it's been politically incorrect to talk about differences between men and women. And that's because about 40 or 50 years ago, we began to come to grips with the inequalities between men and women in our society. And hey, there are inequalities between men and women in our society, aren't there? And it isn't fair. So someone began to say, you know what the problem is? The problem is people see men and women as different. And when you say two things are different, it automatically implies superiority and inferiority. So what we need to do is downplay the differences. We need to begin to say that apart from the obvious biological differences, there are no differences between men and women. We're just identical. The result, equality. Well, what's the problem? Well, the problem is first it's based on a false assumption. The assumption that difference implies inequality. Is that true? Apples, oranges, which is superior? They're just different. Difference doesn't always imply superiority and inferiority. You know, the other problem has to do with the fact that we're just different. And everybody notices it. And that's why after 40 years now, you can go to the bookstore and find a book like Men Are From and Women Are From. And what a counterswing. Now it's like people are saying, whoa, look, we're not just different, we're from different planets, maybe galaxies. Have you read some of this research about studies they're doing on the human brain, males and females, trying to understand how we think and feel in different ways? You know, they've taken women and they've wired electrodes to their brains. Now, men, these were professionals. Do not try this at home. They wired electrodes to their brains, and then what they try to do is get women to feel something. You see, we've learned a lot over the years about how the brain works and what happens in different parts of the brain. You remember your high school biology. You remember there's two hemispheres. Not the north and the south like we have on Earth, but there's kind of the left and the right. And each one has its own function. How do we know that? Well, mostly working with victims of stroke. Because if you can do something 1 minute, you have a stroke, and it's easy to tell where the stroke is, and suddenly you lose an ability. Well, guess where that ability came from? So we know, for example, that the left hemisphere of your brain is factual, logical, orderly, step-by-step, mathematical. The speech center is in the left hemisphere of your brain. The right hemisphere of your brain, well, that's for people that want to go to art school. It cares nothing about order and logic and mathematics. It's spatial, and it's colorful, and it's creative. That's the right hemisphere of your brain. You've got these two different people living in your head. Felix Unger and Oscar Madison are living together. An odd couple inside your cranium. And they're glued together by this thick bundle of nerve fibers called the corpus callosum. That's like a phone network that lets the two halves of your brain talk to one another, right? Okay. They take women, they wire electrodes to their brains, they get them to feel something, they have them watch General Hospital, let's say. And when these women get to feeling, the scientists are watching the scope looking for electrical activity in the brain. Where should it be? It should be in the right, it should be in the emotional center of the brain, but you know what? It isn't. When a woman gets to feeling, the electrical activity is in the right and the left and the north and the south. It's all over. She's feeling using everything all at once. And then they ask her to think about something abstract or complex. They're expecting it to be a blip in the left hemisphere of the brain. It's not. It's in the north and the south and the left and the right. When a woman thinks, she thinks using her entire brain. And researchers have said, hey, you know what? Women are global thinkers. They use their whole brain at the same time. But you see, men, they've done the same study with us. And they wire those electrodes to our brains. And they sit us down in front of General Hospital and we fall asleep. We just feel around for the remote, you know? And when they finally get us to feel something, guess what? It's a blip in the right hemisphere of the brain. That's all. And when they get us to think, it's a blip in the left hemisphere of the brain. That's all. And researchers have said, you know, men are sort of compartmental thinkers. They have specific parts of the brain reserved for specific tasks. And women always start taking notes right about now. Men use only half their brains. I can use that. You know, honey, if you could use your whole brain the way I do, you might understand what's going on here. Yeah. Now, the point is here, the two halves of our brain, whether you're male or female, they've got to talk to one another. Did you know that in a woman, the corpus callosum is a thicker, denser bundle of nerve fibers than it is in a man? That means the two halves of a woman's brain communicate more efficiently. If you think of it as a telephone network, in a woman, it is like a high-tech, state-of-the-art fiber optic network. In a man, it's a little more like 2 tin cans with a string. Ladies, have you ever said to your husband, how do you feel? And just had him go. Has he ever actually said, I don't know? You don't know how you feel? Brain damage. If I can't ask you, who do I ask? What do you mean you don't know? You know, he's not really saying, I don't know. He's just saying, give me a minute, give me a minute. Because you see, your question went into this ear. It went into the right hemisphere of the brain. The emotional center said, here's the answer, here's how I feel. But now it has to take one tin can and pull the string tight, and it has to shout the answer through to the speech center in the left hemisphere of the brain. And about 3 days later, your husband says, remember when you asked me how I feel? I feel fine. Right? Well, thank you, honey, for bearing your soul to me. You know, men, if they ever get rid of the word fine, we're dead. Fine, I'm fine. That's right. You know, men have said to me, I have feelings. Yeah, I can cry. But for me, my feelings, it's like I'm in a dark room and I'm feeling around on the wall for the light switch. It just takes time for me to connect with what I feel. Are we different or what? Women, because you have these two halves of the brain working together incredibly well, this is how women live their lives, like this. This is not a moose. Got men pulling out rifles in the back of the room. This is not a moose. This is an antenna. This is the radar array on the Starship Enterprise. Picking up signals from distant galaxies. That's why women are omnipresent. That's why when you were a kid and you were into mischief on the 3rd floor of your house in the closet, your mom shouted from downstairs, what's going on up there? You know, if Dad was watching you, you could have been on fire. And he wouldn't have known. He would have said, stay off the furniture. Because dads don't live their lives like this, because dads live their lives this way, right? They focus intensely on one thing at a time. So if your antenna, ladies, is like this, your husband's is like this. He's got one little floppy antenna, like a cordless telephone. And if he walks 30 feet away from the house, he loses the signal, doesn't he? Women, this is you. Men, this is you. Have you noticed it? There is something about this that's just like the nature of God. It is called omnipresence. And there is something about this, man, that creative force, that focus and intensity, that's very much like the nature of God too. But it takes both of us. You see, that's why one says their oneness reflects the character and unity of God. It's not just the diversity, but the diversity and oneness. If you just read once through the Bible, you will find it says that in the nature of God there is diversity, but in that diversity there is perfect unity. And in marriage, it's when two very different people can come together and achieve that same thing, harmony and oneness. That's when we reflect what God is like. And that's why 2 says their oneness is a living picture of the intimate relationship between Jesus Christ and his followers. That's deep stuff. That's why you've got to be a philosopher this morning. And when Paul, the apostle, wrote those words, he said, this mystery is great. See, he says, couples who mirror God's image experience oneness with their Creator. So that's the first original page of the blueprint for marriage. Originally, marriage was meant to be a system where two intentionally different people came together and achieved oneness, and in so doing, reflected what God himself is like. All right, let's turn the page and go back to the second original page in the blueprint for marriage. It tells us under Roman numeral 2 that originally, marriage was intended to mutually complete one another, to allow us to experience companionship. Again, in the book of Genesis, it says, then the Lord God said, it is not good for the man to be alone. I will make him a helper suitable for him. It's not good for the man to be alone. Someone once said, a man alone is in bad company. So, letter A tells us that companionship replaces isolation. Please notice something. You are not writing marriage replaces isolation, because that's not necessarily true. Companionship replaces isolation. Number 1 says to mutually complete one another means to create something together that does not exist apart. I was watching a nature thing, a National Geographic special a while ago, and it was on these crocodiles in Egypt that lay along the Nile River. I mean, it's the same kind of a situation that for years has been the problem of people that go down to the Nile to wash some clothing and they just don't come back. Because crocodiles are like eating machines. They literally have a brain about the size of a golf ball. It's an eating machine. In fact, if you do shoot a crocodile, you don't walk over and pick up the crocodile, because it's capable of biting you, even killing you while it's dead, because its reflexes are still working for a minute. It's just an eating machine. And yet, along the Nile River, crocodiles will lay there with their mouths wide open, and one species of bird, which has come to be known as the crocodile bird, will actually fly down and land in the crocodile's mouth. And the crocodile won't close his mouth. What the bird does is picks food out of the crocodile's teeth. That's the bird's whole food supply. And in so doing this, he keeps the crocodile's teeth from decaying. It's a kind of dental hygienist bird. That's a great arrangement. But my question is, who was the first bird to try that one? You know, this is what scientists call a symbiotic relationship, and there's all kinds of them in nature. The termites that are devouring your house back home right now cannot digest wood. But there's an organism that lives inside them that can digest wood, but it's a completely different species, completely unrelated. So how do the two of them get together? Who knows? Nobody knows how these things start, but they're common in nature. Two different species come together so that together they have something that they didn't have alone. Well, you know, back about 50 years ago, the radical feminists had this slogan: a woman without a man is like a fish without a bicycle. They were trying to say women can get along without men. Well, you know, I'm not sure that's exactly so. You can't say a woman without a man is like a fish without water. You can't say that. But you could at least say a woman without a man is like a fish without another fish. Because, you know, the fact is, we're not different species, are we? And in fact, the Bible's telling us that we were actually designed like interlocking pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. We were made with complementarity in mind. We were made so that we could interlock and have something called companionship. We could have something together that we did not have alone. But 2 says self-centered individuality destroys oneness and companionship. Joey and I used to live in Southern California. We were in a department store checking out one day. There was an older couple in front of us in line, and the woman said something that the man didn't understand, and so he said, I don't understand. So she turned to this guy, and she raised her voice so that everyone in the store could share in this Kodak moment, you know? Have you had that happen to you? She said, "Of course you don't understand. You never have understood, and you never will." Now, if you've ever had that happen to you in public, you know, what you automatically do is you kind of go, you sort of look down to sort of help the guy save whatever dignity he's got left, right? And as I'm looking down, but looking up a little bit, I notice he's got a ring just like mine. He's got a wedding ring on. And it occurs to me, this isn't a brother and sister having some sibling spat. This is a husband and a wife. And they've been married a long time. In fact, they may have come to one of our conferences. And on Friday night, when we asked who's been married the longest, that could have been the couple that won the book. You know, suddenly it occurred to me that not all 50th anniversaries are golden, are they? See, marriage is not a frequent flyer program. Nobody's offering you free patio furniture just for logging miles. The goal here isn't just to stay married. I mean, that's nice, but the goal isn't just to stay married. The goal is to achieve companionship. I had a friend that didn't get married until he was about 40. He said to me one day, you know, if you think it's bad to be single and lonely, you should try getting married and finding out you're still lonely. Ouch. If you're single out there or if you're engaged, this makes no sense to you at all. Because to you, marriage equals companionship. But every married couple here will tell you marriage does not equal companionship. Now, marriage can make companionship possible, but it isn't a guarantee. And if you're here today and you're married and the person sitting beside you is not yet your companion, then you're experiencing a kind of loneliness I'm not sure anybody else actually can, right? Because it's the deepest form of loneliness, to be dying of thirst, but to be within eyeshot of water. I don't believe people want to get married. I know that sounds radical, but I don't think people want to get married. I think what people want is a companion, because the human heart was wired for companionship. We long for it, we need it, we want it. We marry seeking companionship. The problem is sometimes we just stop a little short. We tell ourselves, I guess I'm here. I got married, that was the finish line. We tell people a marriage is a starting line, not a finish line. Getting married did not provide a companion. It provided a husband or a wife, and that's a very different thing. Now, you want companionship? The race just got started. You just crossed the started line. Now, what are you going to do now? Will you work towards companionship? Letter B says companionship in marriage is God's provision to meet our deep longings for close, intimate relationships. And it can. Because the good news is marriage itself is designed to be the ideal way to achieve companionship. But we're going to have to talk more throughout the weekend about working toward that goal. And C says couples who mutually complete one another experience oneness with each other. All right, that's the second original page for the blueprint of marriage. The third, on your next page, says that originally marriage was intended to multiply a godly legacy. And that means marriage in part has always been about raising good kids. Back to Genesis again. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." We've done a pretty good job of this, haven't we? Letter A says God created men and women as his ambassadors who would glorify him on earth. The word you're writing in right now is ambassadors. What is an ambassador? Well, an ambassador is someone who really is not a citizen of your country. These are people who live somewhere else, but they maintain a residence in your country. Why? Because their job is to reflect the wishes of their country to yours. We talk about ambassadors of goodwill. That means the ambassador's job is to make the home country look good. And that's exactly our goal here. Our job is to glorify God. What does that mean? Anyway, well, glorify is kind of an old religious word. It literally means to illuminate, to light up. I've got 2 spotlights in the back of this room. Their job is to glorify me. because I've got a kind of a dark jacket and I'm against a dark background. And if you turn off these lights, I disappear. I just disappear. I am hard for you to see, to pick out against the backdrop. We live in a world that's very busy and very complicated and sometimes very disappointing, and God can be very hard to see. Just disappears into the backdrop. Our job as his ambassadors, as citizens of his country who reside here, is to light him up. Is to illuminate him, to make him easy for other people to see. Now, a part of this process of making God look good is making our own marriages and families work. You see, letter B says marriage provides the divine context for having children. What does that mean, a divine context? Well, I noticed driving in that here in Alabama, at least along the shore, you have a lot of nice white sand. If you come and visit us in North Carolina, you don't find white sand. You find red clay. Now, red clay is a problem because it's very acidic, so certain things grow well in it, like azaleas. You should see the spring in North Carolina. Other things don't grow well in it, like grass. The problem with red clay is that it stains everything. So if you build a house and you put in that nice white carpet, the kids are going to come running in with red clay on their feet, and it's almost impossible to get off the carpet. So people are in a hurry to grow grass. If you can afford it, you sod. For the rest of us, there are these big tanker trucks that come to the houses with a big hose attached to the back. And what they do is they walk around the yard and they just spray down this greenish glop. You know what it is? It's peat moss and water and fertilizer and grass seed. Everything you need to grow grass. It's the context for grass. Instant yard. It's like a toupee for your front yard. They actually color the peat moss green so it looks like fake grass. Isn't that great? What happens if they forget the water? Does it matter? What if they leave out the grass seed? Make any difference? Yeah, because you see, every element is important to the context. Each element makes growth possible. Marriage is a context for raising good kids. What does marriage bring together? A man, a woman, in a love relationship, in a committed relationship, so there's security. There are finances. That means there's physical security, right? There's emotional attachments to the children. There's everything a child needs to grow to be healthy and strong. Marriage is the divine context. So people say to me sometimes, does marriage matter? Do I need to be married to raise kids? And I tell them, no, it doesn't matter at all. All you need is a man and a woman in a lifetime committed, loving relationship where there's physical and financial security. That's all you need, which is, of course, a marriage, right? That's why I said at the beginning, marriage is not an accident. We can't just redefine it. Now, I should ask this. If you have the context, everything you need, does that guarantee good kids? Does it? No. Because, you know, what we're dealing with here is separate human beings, and they will make choices of their own. But do you believe that good kids just come randomly from whatever kind of home? You know, I don't believe that. I believe that in life you play the odds, right? There are very few guarantees in this world, but there are statistical probabilities. And the fact is, good kids come from good marriages and good families. So if you want the best possible chance you have for raising a good one, then you work on the context, on your marriage. C says that there's an important part of the context we must not leave out. Oneness in marriage is necessary in order to multiply a godly legacy. So 1 says neither women or men are made emotionally, spiritually, or physically to raise children by themselves. Child rearing requires a team effort. We need 2 of us. Sometimes 3 or 4 would be helpful. But it isn't just quantity that matters. We need a male and a female. Because in every human personality, there are masculine and feminine characteristics. And to grow to be healthy and whole individuals, we need exposure to both a man and a woman. It requires a team effort. 2 says to appreciate their sexual identity, children must see a harmonious marriage modeled by their parents. That's the important word there. Not recommended, not taught, but actually shown, modeled by their parents. My firstborn, Tommy, was born not only human, but male. I checked. But Tommy didn't come with an instruction booklet, anything that will tell him as he grows up what it means to be male. And yet, as Tommy grows up, and he's now 22, boy, does time fly, he has to know not only what it means to be human, but what it means to be a male. Now, where will he learn that? I mean, there's no course in high school or college called Masculine 101. In fact, I'm very glad there's not. I'm afraid of what they'd be taught. But he has to learn the lesson, so where does he learn? Well, the hard reality is he learns from me. And even if I don't say anything about it, he will still learn from me, because he'll watch the way I interact with his mom and with his sisters. And from that, he learns lessons about what it means to be a man in relation to women. So what is the model that you're showing your children? And then 3 says the roles of husband and wife are best understood by children as their parents model a harmonious marriage in their home. There's that word again. Why do we keep focusing on this modeling thing? A writer named James Baldwin once said, "Children have never been good at listening to their elders, but they have never failed to imitate them." That means your kids are not listening to you. They are absorbing you. And you know that's true because you absorbed your mother or father, didn't you? That's why even now at the age of 50 or 60, you can find yourself saying something your mom or dad did. It'll even catch you off guard, won't it? Because you just picked it up. You just absorbed it one day. That means as parents, our chief responsibility is to become the person that you want your children to become. Because like it or not, that's what they will become. That's why we have to build a good marriage, because like it or not, they will instinctively pattern their marriage after yours. It's the only one they've seen. 4 says their best hope for children to understand unconditional love comes as parents demonstrate that kind of love in the home. And so at the bottom, couples who multiply a godly legacy experience oneness with their children. Well, it sounds simple, doesn't it? Those are the 3 original pages of the blueprint. Marriage was supposed to allow us to mirror God's image, to mutually complete one another, and to multiply a godly legacy. If it's really that simple and clear, why is it so hard? Well, if you'll turn the page, I mentioned last night that the principles we're teaching on marriage and the family, they are biblical principles. So we think it's important at the end of this session just to give you a little bit of perspective on why the blueprint is so difficult. On your next page under Roman numeral 4, it says God's purposes for marriage are challenged by an opposing force. And A says, from the beginning, the scriptures state that Satan has challenged God and his purposes for marriage. Now, the vast majority of Americans believe that there is some kind of God out there. Fewer Americans believe that there is a Satan or a devil. A lot of people believe that that's just a label that we use to describe all the things that go wrong in the world. But if you read through the Bible, you'll find Satan described as a living being. He is not God's evil twin. He is not his counterpart or his equal in power. No, he's just a created being. But he is no clown. When he was created, he was the most perfect, the most beautiful, the most intelligent being that had ever existed. But there was some fatal flaw in him, some bent, some twist that made him go bad. And that's why letter B says Satan's opposition is focused on independence from God. He was second in power and beauty only to God. But for some reason no one can fully explain, number 2 was not good enough. He wanted number 1. He wanted to be God himself. And that's why 1 says the basis of his opposition was pride. Pride says, I will do it myself. And so, number 2, this is why this is important to us. 2 says, earth became the battlefield for a spiritual war. When Satan took his bad turn, for the very first time in our universe, there was a second and contrary will functioning. And along comes humankind. We are born into a kind of buffet where there's choices to be made. We can decide which way we'll do it, whose will be done. Now, guess which way every human heart naturally leans. Well, have you ever said this? I will do it myself. Pride is a part of every human heart. We tend to follow the wrong leader. And that's why letter C says God created mankind and place them in the context of this spiritual battle. Which way does human nature go? You know, I have to tell you, I was a little naive about children when ours came along. I always thought that kids were like puppies. You know, you have them to play with them, right? And you get them out and you roll around on the floor with them, and then you put them away at night and get them out the next day and do some more of that. That's what you see on the TV shows. I was disappointed. I discovered quickly after my children were born that we had actually given birth to separate human beings. And I couldn't just put them out on the porch. That didn't work like it did for the puppy. You know, you had to live in the house with them. And when my kids reached the age of 1 and we tried to feed them solid food, I learned even then that my kids were separate human beings. And they had this thing called a will. And I could not imagine how much of it could be packed into such a little body. I remember when Aaron was 2 years old, and you know what they call the twos? Yeah, the terrible twos, not the delightful, the charming twos. No, there's a reason they call it the terrible twos, because that's when human pride and will comes out in all its glory. Once I was watching Aaron. Joy was gone. I was watching Aaron the way dads watch children. I was in the family room reading the newspaper. Maybe she was on fire. I don't know. She was back in the bedroom, and she starts to cry. Now, if you're a parent, you know there are different kinds of cries, right? There's the hurt cry, which of course makes you jump up and go running. But there's also the tired cry and just the annoyed and cranky cry. Then there's the angry cry. And nobody misses that one either, because it sounds a lot like the Tarzan yodel, doesn't it? It's an octave higher than any other kind of cry. And if your kids start the angry cry, finish reading the paper, because they'll still be crying when you're done. You got time here. So finally I get up, I go back to the bedroom. This is the angry cry. Erin is angry. And she's in her room all by herself. She's standing in front of the dresser. She's got the bottom drawer open about 6 inches. Inside the drawer is a doll that she wants out, but it will not come out because it's turned at a right angle to the opening. She's got a hold of it with both of her hands. She is pulling on it for all she's worth, screaming her head off. Ah! I just laughed at her. So I walk over, I just reach in the drawer with her, turn the doll 90 degrees, and it goes, just pops right out of the drawer. I will never forget, Erin just looked at that doll, looked at that drawer, and then she stuck it back in the drawer, turned it the way it was, and started pulling on it again. It's like she was saying in her little 2-year-old mind, "You fool! I don't just want the doll. I want it my way." You know, as I watch my 2-year-old daughter, I'm thinking to myself, you know, people grow up, but they don't get a lot more sophisticated than this. How many fights have you had in your marriage that boiled down to nothing more than that? I don't just want it. I want it my way. That's all it really was all about. And that's because this is a part of every human heart. And so D says, because mankind willfully chose independence from God, there have been at least 3 consequences man has suffered throughout history. The first consequence, the image of God and humanity has been defaced. Are human beings still made in the image of God? You bet they are. The problem is we're not good mirrors anymore. We're more like funhouse mirrors. We give some glimpse of the nature of God, but it's distorted and twisted. I've been asked many times, do you think people are basically good or basically bad? My answer is, yeah. I think we're basically both, and that's the tragedy of human nature, isn't it? We are capable of good and noble things, but the same person in the wrong circumstances is capable of tremendous evil. Alexander Solzhenitsyn once said, the line between good and evil runs through the middle of every human heart. So we're made in the image of God, but now the image has been defaced. On your next page, 2 says marital companionship has been threatened by shame and guilt and fear. B, by blame shifting. And C, by a battle for control. Well, it's hard to be a companion when the relationship's filled with shame, guilt, fear, blame, and a battle for control. And the third consequence, number 3, says a godly legacy has been challenged by a godless legacy. And that means our willfulness and selfishness that plays out in marriage, it's a model passed on to our children. It affects the kids as well. Now, the 3 consequences I just described, are they sounding strangely familiar? Well, they should, because, you see, each one of them parallels one of the original pages of the blueprint. Isn't that right? We said that originally, marriage was intended to allow us to mirror the image of God, but now the image of God has been defaced. We said originally marriage was intended to allow us to have a companion, but now companionship's threatened by shame and guilt and fear and blame and a battle for control. We said originally marriage was supposed to be the context, the divine context for raising good kids, but even the context has been damaged and distorted. And we close with a reminder here, letter E. E says Satan's power is threatened by couples who are becoming one. Therefore, Satan concentrates his major attacks on them. Why? Because Satan is not God's evil twin. He is not equal to him in power, and he can't harm God. So he will just harm those things that are made in his image, because that's the best he can do. And when we pursue the original blueprint for marriage, it is an offense and an assault on Satan. And so he will strike back. That's why in the book of Ephesians from the New Testament, it says this: our struggle is not against flesh and blood. Does that sound like anybody you know? That's the person sitting beside you today. We could say, our struggle is not against our husbands and wives. Really, what does that mean? It means your mate is not your enemy. In fact, I'd like you just to take a second and turn to one another and say that. I want you to look at your mate. I want you to say, you are not my enemy. Do that. You are not my enemy. Now, for some of you, that's easy to say. For some of you, that's not easy to say, because what's going on in your marriage right now makes you believe they are your enemy. In fact, they've been acting like your enemy. And all we want to say to you is there is more going on in your marriage than meets the eye. What you struggle with, the conflicts you have, are the tip of an iceberg. And like all icebergs, 70% of it is below the water. You are experiencing just a skirmish in a major cosmic battle. That's why Paul said your struggle's not against your husband and it's not against your wife, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Wow. These are interesting. Did you ever see these before? Maybe some of you here have. These were actually collected off the ground in Kuwait during the last Persian Gulf War. Remember how the Persian Gulf War went? It had 2 phases to the strategy. There was an air war and there was a ground war. And our strategy, which worked very well, was if you do the air war right, there's not much ground war left to be fought. And that's exactly the way it worked. When the air war came to an end and our tanks went rolling into Kuwait, the biggest problem we had was handling the number of people who were trying to surrender to us. It was a tough thing on the enemy because, you see, we had devastated their lines of supply. We had chased off all their officers. They had no ammunition. They had no reinforcements. It was a pretty lonely thing to be on the front lines in Kuwait during the last Persian Gulf War. And when the air war came to an end and the ground war was about to begin, our bombers flew over their lines one more time and dropped these. Not smart bombs, but these. They're just pieces of paper, that's all. Leaflets. What's this called? Propaganda or psychological warfare. Now, why do we bother with this? Because, we've got smart bombs that can fly down ventilator shafts. Well, these are cheaper. And these are just as effective. See, on the back of each of these, there's a message in Arabic. The top one is printed to look exactly like Iraqi currency. We're pretty good counterfeiters. This one is printed to show all the flags of the coalition whose tanks would be rolling over them the next day. This is the Iraqi flag, but it has blood stains on the front. And in the back of each of them, there's a message in Arabic. One reads, The meal that Saddam Hussein gives you is what? The daily menu for the Allied forces meals includes, and then it lists the breakfast, lunch, and dinner menu. And below that says, prisoners of war also eat with the soldiers of the Allied forces the above-mentioned meals. On the back of another one it says, my brother, the Iraqi soldier, it distresses us that you go back to Iraq dead or handicapped. Ouch. Psychological warfare. Why do we bother? Why does it work? Because we know he's hungry, we know he's alone, we know he's angry, and we know there are doubts in his mind. I think that's a pretty good description of marriage from time to time, don't you think? You see, we understand that if our enemy has a limited amount of time and materiel, if we can work on his doubts, if we can get him to spend his limited resources in conflict with one another, then he'll never be able to stand shoulder to shoulder and put up a common front against us. Well, the enemy of our souls is at least as smart as any human general. And he knows that in every marriage, in every human life, there's a limited amount of time and a limited amount of material. And if he can get us to spend our time in marriage like this, squared off, face to face, in argument, demanding the things we want, in conflict with one another, we'll never be able to do this. We'll never be able to stand shoulder to shoulder as real partners and make the difference, have the impact on the world that we need to have. And that's why we have to learn how to stand shoulder to shoulder.
That was Family Life Weekend to Remember conference speaker Tim Downs, speaking on God's purpose for oneness. On the next CD, we'll hear from Jeff Schulte on God's plan for oneness.